Hi there, I'm Judith Cobb, Master Herbalist, Natural Nutrition Clinical Practitioner, and Comprehensive Certified Iridology Instructor. I want to share with you some of the foundations of eye anatomy today. Understanding the anatomy of the eye makes it so much easier to become a great iridologist. The first thing we need to recognize when we are looking at eyes is how do we tell if it's a right eye or a left eye? Professionally shot iridology photos are taken very, very close up. So we lose landmarks like the nose, we may lose the inner canthus, we lose a lot of the features. We get only the eye, just like you see with these images that are on the screen now. One of the things to be aware of to determine whether it's a right eye or a left eye is that the pupil is never in the exact center of the iris. It is always slightly off center. So what that means is that the side of the iris that is the narrowest is going to be the side that is closest to the nose. So I usually describe that as this is going to name the eye for us. When we see that the narrow side is to the right of the pupil as we are looking directly at the person, that means it's a right eye. If the narrow side is on the left side of the pupil, it's a left eye. If you don't get that right, everything you do for your iris analysis, well, not everything, but some things are going to be desperately wrong. We also need to be aware of some of the different structures of the eye. So let's just review the fact that the entire eyeball is a neural receptor and that it is connected to the optic nerve that goes directly to the brain. It's not a series of nerves, it is one nerve. With the eye, we also have this tough outer coating that is called the sclera. And the sclera at the front of the eye is what we call the white of the eye. The sclera becomes clear when it comes right across the front of the eye, and that is the cornea. The cornea, of course, has to be clear in order to let images through. Directly behind the cornea, we have a fluid-filled chamber that is called the anterior chamber or the front chamber, filled with aqueous humor. Then we have the iris, which is actually mostly muscle. We have the lens, and then we have the posterior chamber, which is filled with vitreous humor. So of course with iridology, we are mostly focused on the iris and somewhat on the sclera. Note that the pupil is actually an opening in the iris. When we go to a cross section of the iris, we have to orient ourselves first. And with this, what we are seeing is this is the pupil right here. So we're looking at one side of the iris. This is the pupil. This is the edge of the iris closest to the pupil. As this moves back, we eventually get to the outer edge of the iris and the sclera. We have first the anterior border, which is the very front layer of the iris itself. So the cornea sits on top of this. Then we have the anterior border. The anterior border is where most of the pigment is held. And so if we have a blue eye, for instance, there's very little pigment, and that's going to let us see some features in the eye. If we have a very darkly colored eye, so dark brown eye, for instance, there's enough pigment there that it's actually sitting on top of the fibers and it hides the fibers. And that means we don't get to see all of the features. The next thing we have is called the stroma. That is this body of tissue right down here. Everything between the anterior border and the posterior epithelium. This stroma is made up of trabeculae. We'll talk about those some more in a moment. We also have blood vessels. We have muscle fibers in here. We have more muscle fibers. And nerve endings, lots of nerve endings in this. Pretty amazing stuff. We also have the posterior membrane, which is also known as the dilator muscle, and it is right here. This is the muscle, we're going to talk about this more too, that actually opens up the pupil. We have the posterior epithelium, which is this bottom 2 layers of cells here. It's actually just 2 layers thick, very dark. It can dark brown or black depending on what source you read. And this makes up the very back layer of the iris. As we look at the actual muscles of the eye, we see that there are 2 sets of muscles that are important. So this is the entire eyeball, and this is the iris. The outer part of this iris is the dilator muscle, and we can see that we've got all these muscle fibers in here. These muscle fibers are anchored in at the sclera edge, so this edge is not going to move. This is the edge that moves. So as these fibers ratchet in on each other and that dilator muscle shortens, it is this edge that's going to move. And you can imagine that as this gets shorter, this edge moves back. As that moves back, because this is anchored into this other muscle, it literally pulls this other muscle and opens up the pupil. So that's what happens when things are dimly lit. The sphincter muscle, on the other hand, has its muscle fibers that go around and around, and as they ratchet in together, they make the pupil smaller. And so that's what happens in bright light. But the only way that pupil is opened up again is if those dilator muscles contract, and that pulls the sphincter muscle open. Those fibers, or rather in the eye we have trabeculae. Trabeculae are actually very tiny capillaries that have a collagen sheath. They enter in at the edge of the iris, come in towards the middle of the iris, and then go back out to the outer edge. The blood flow towards the middle of the iris is arterial. The blood flow going out towards the edge again is venous. These again have a collagen sheath, which is why they appear white. At the inner part of the iris, where we have that sphincter muscle, the flow it starts at the inner pupillary edge, goes towards the center of the iris, and then does a hairpin turn and comes back out. Again, arterial flow going from the edge to the center, venous flow coming back out to the edge, and all of these blood vessels, these tiny capillaries, are coated with collagen. We know that there are some 28,000 nerve endings in the iris. We don't know what they do. We haven't figured them all out yet. So there you have it, a quick eye anatomy lesson to get you ready to learn iridology. If you're interested in learning more iridology, please visit iridology.education. And if you're interested in taking an iridology course, please visit iridology.education/priority. Thanks, and I'll see you again. Bye for now.